A billionaire threw his pregnant wife into the rain at 11 p.m. He did not know she was carrying his baby. He did not know she had just built the software that made him rich. And he definitely did not know that 6 months later, she would walk into the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan on the arm of the only man powerful enough to destroy him completely. But here is what makes this story truly chilling. She was not there for revenge. She was there for dinner. And that made everything so much worse. Brian Thorne had replaced her with a 23-year-old Instagram model. He had erased her from his life like she was nothing. He was absolutely certain the past was behind him. Until the moment he looked up from his wine glass and saw her, 7 months pregnant, glowing, untouchable, and holding hands with Adrian Vance, the billionaire who owned every company Brian depended on. His heart did not just stop. It shattered into a million pieces right there on that white tablecloth. This is not a story about a broken heart. This is a story about a man who threw away a diamond because he wanted something that glittered. And by the time he realized his mistake, that diamond was already set in another man's crown. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel worthless by someone who should have loved you, this story will feel like justice. Stay until the end, because his final moment will leave you speechless. The chandeliers inside Lorne were not crafted from glass. The rumor Brian Thorne enjoyed circulating was that they were made of solid diamonds. It was a story that suited his image. He was the man who could transform sand into gold, the tech titan who climbed from the tough streets of Chicago to the penthouse apartments of Manhattan. Tonight, Brian was seated at the finest table in the establishment, the one kept for royalty and world leaders. Seated opposite him was Chloe, a 23-year-old model whose beauty was as striking as her inability to carry on a conversation. She was busy swiping through Instagram, her perfectly polished thumb pausing on pictures of herself. "Put the phone down, Chloe," Brian said, his voice quiet yet firm. "We are celebrating. The deal with Concade Logistics is complete. I am now officially the controlling shareholder." Chloe glanced up, her blue eyes wide but empty. "Oh, that is right. Hooray, honey. Does this mean we can finally buy that villa in Co? The one that comes with the boat dock?" Brian gently swirled the vintage Pinot Noir in his glass, sensing a familiar, heavy ache deep in his chest. It was the ache of profound boredom. "We can purchase the entire lake if we want to," he said under his breath, but the excitement of those words had disappeared. 6 months. That is how much time had passed since he and Emma divorced. Emma, her name still felt like ash on his tongue. She was his sweetheart from college, the woman who had mended his socks when he was too broke to buy new ones, the one who would stay awake through the night to check his first business proposals. But as the numbers in Brian's bank account swelled, Emma remained the same simple person. She preferred quiet evenings at home. She chose comfortable footwear. She had no idea how to flatter investors or take command of a room. Brian had talked himself into believing he had simply moved beyond her. He required a status symbol on his arm, not an actual partner. So, he ended things with her in a cruel way. He recalled the day with perfect clarity. He presented her with divorce papers and a check, informing her that she no longer fit into his future. She did not yell. She did not smash a vase. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a soul-crushing sadness, and whispered, "You will understand the cost of this, Brian," before she walked away into the pouring rain. "Brian, you are daydreaming," Chloe complained, tapping her fork on the rim of her wine glass. "I want the lobster, but our waiter is completely ignoring me." "He is not ignoring you. He is just busy," Brian retorted, his patience wearing thin. All of a sudden, the restaurant's background noise, the gentle jazz, the low hum of voices, The clatter of silverware faded away. It was not a slow quieting. It was a sharp, unified intake of breath. Brian scowled. Celebrities visited Loroni all the time. A silence like this signaled the arrival of someone with genuine influence. "Who is that?" Chloe inquired, stretching her neck to see. "Is that some kind of movie star?" Brian shifted his chair slightly to see the grand main entrance. The maitre d', a man named Pierre, who typically looked down on everyone, was almost in a full bow. Two people entered, escorted by four security guards who moved with the quiet deadliness of highly trained soldiers. The man was tall, easily over 6 feet 2 inches, dressed in a custom-made charcoal suit that likely cost more than Brian's first car. He had hair that was a mix of salt and pepper and a jawline so defined it looked as if it were carved from stone. Brian went completely still. He knew that man. Everyone in his industry knew him. It was Adrian Vance, the chief executive officer of Vance Global, the individual who controlled the shipping companies Brian relied on, the satellites Brian leased, and the banks Brian borrowed from. Adrian Vance came from old, powerful money. He was a predator so formidable that other predators steered clear of him. But it was not Adrian who caused the color to drain completely from Brian's face. It was the woman on Adrian's arm. She wore a long gown of emerald green silk that hugged her figure before flowing down to the floor. Her hair, which she once kept in a simple bun, now fell in shining, perfect waves down her back. Around her neck was a sapphire necklace that captured the light, shining with a fiery blue intensity. It was Emma, but not the Emma he remembered. The timid woman was gone. This woman moved with her head held high, her eyes scanning the room with a calm, intimidating self-assurance, and that is when Brian noticed it. The silk of her dress was cut perfectly to fit the very clear round curve of her belly. She was very pregnant. Brian's hand clenched his wine glass so tightly that the stem broke. Red wine flowed across the perfect white tablecloth, looking unsettlingly like a spreading stain of blood. "Oh my goodness, Brian! See what you have done!" Chloe cried out, leaping backward to get away from the spill. Brian did not hear her. He could not hear anything over the sound roaring in his ears. Pregnant? She looked to be at least 7 months along. He did the calculation in his mind instantly. 6 months had passed since the divorce. She was 7 months pregnant. The entire room started to spin. The baby, was it his, or had she moved on from him that fast? As the host guided Adrian and Emma across the restaurant, their path took them right past Brian's table. Brian felt frozen, unable to tear his eyes away. He expected Emma to look away, to cower, to hide. But as they came closer, Emma's gaze locked directly with his. There was no trace of fear in her eyes. There was no sign of love either. There was just a cold, smooth detachment, like seeing a complete stranger on a train. Adrian Vance gently put a protective hand on the small of Emma's back, bending down to say something quietly in her ear. Emma let out a laugh, a true and musical sound Brian had not heard from her in years. They swept past his table, leaving behind the scent of jasmine and expensive cologne. "Wait a minute," Chloe whispered, her eyes becoming narrow. "Is that not your ex-wife, the plain one?" Brian just stared at the red stain growing on the tablecloth. "Yes," he managed to say, his voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "That is Emma." A waiter hurried to their table to clean the spill, offering endless apologies as though it was his own fault that Brian had lost control. Brian impatiently waved him off, his hunger completely gone. "I do not understand," Chloe said, picking apart a roll of bread. "You told me she was broke. You told me she was a nobody. So why is she with him?" "That is Adrian Vance. My own father says Adrian Vance has enough money to buy this entire city if he wanted to." I do not know, Chloe, Brian said sharply, loud enough to make a nearby couple look over. He dropped his voice, his hands balling into fists, beneath the table. I do not know. On the other side of the room, Adrian and Emma had been led to the private alcove table, the one that even Brian was never able to reserve. It had a sweeping view of the city lights, yet it was private enough for a discreet meeting. Brian watched them intensely. He watched Adrian hold Emma's chair for her. He saw how the restaurant staff attended to them, treating Emma like she was a queen. But the thing that bothered him the most was the way Adrian looked at her. It was not the expression of a man with a beautiful woman for show. It was a look of complete and utter adoration in the way his hand came to rest so gently on her stomach after he sat down. That single motion seemed possessive, protective, and fatherly all at once. Is it his child? Brian's thoughts were racing. That is impossible. We were still together 7 months ago. It must be mine. But she never said a word to me. A powerful feeling of entitlement suddenly washed over him. If that was his heir, then he had a right to know. He was Brian Thorne. He was not someone who was kept in the dark. I am going to the men's room, Brian said as a lie, getting to his feet suddenly. Do not be long, Chloe complained. I still want to order dessert. Brian paid her no attention and started walking across the restaurant floor. He was not heading to the restroom. He was walking directly toward the private alcove. His heart was pounding in his chest, filled with a mix of rage and a weird, sudden desperation he had not anticipated. As he got closer, 2 very large men in dark suits emerged from the shadows, blocking his way forward. Step out of my way, Brian ordered, trying to use his authoritative CEO voice. I am an acquaintance. Mr. Vance is not seeing visitors at the moment, one of the guards stated, his tone flat and disinterested. Let him come through, Marcus. A deep voice called from the table. The guards moved apart. Brian stepped into the alcove. Emma did not even bother to look up from her menu. She was glowing, her skin radiant from her pregnancy, her cheeks slightly flushed. She appeared healthier and more stunning than she ever had when they were married. Emma, Brian said, his voice strained. She slowly put down the menu. Her hazel eyes met his. They were cool and distant. Hello, Brian. I was wondering when you would finally decide to march over here. You are pregnant, he said, stating the obvious. Observant as you have always been, she answered, her voice full of sarcasm. Is it? Brian looked over at Adrian, who was observing him with a smirk that was both amused and predatory while he sipped his scotch. Brian's gaze returned to Emma's stomach. Is it mine? Emma let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Yours, Brian? You surrendered the right to ask me that question on the night you threw me out of our home at 11 p.m. because you said I lacked vision. If that is my child, I have rights, Brian hissed, taking a step forward. I have lawyers who can... Sit down, boy. Adrian Vance spoke. He did not yell. He did not get up. He just said the words, and the power in his voice was so absolute that Brian froze in his tracks. Mr. Thorne, Adrian went on, swirling the ice in his glass. It seems you are operating under several false beliefs. Allow me to correct them for you. First, you will not raise your voice to my fiancé. It is upsetting for the baby. Fiancé? The word struck Brian like a punch to the gut. Second, Adrian said, his eyes becoming as solid as steel. About the baby's father. You were too occupied with your, what is she, an Instagram model? You spent the last year of our marriage chasing after her. So you barely laid a hand on your wife. We both remember how things were, Brian. So do not make a fool of yourself by acting like you were an attentive husband. Brian's face turned a deep shade of red. He stared at Emma, looking for any sign of weakness. Emma, tell him. Let him know who I really am. I already told him who you were, Brian, Emma responded gently. She rested a hand on her stomach. I told him you were the man who tore me down just to build yourself up. I told him you were the man who constantly told me I had no value. She then reached over and held Adrian's hand. And then Adrian showed me I was worth everything. You are only with him for his wealth, Brian snapped, his pride beginning to shatter. That is the reason, is it not? You left a millionaire to be with a billionaire. You are nothing but a gold digger, Emma. The temperature in the private dining area seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Adrian placed his glass on the table. The soft sound seemed to echo like a gunshot. Be very careful, Adrian said in a low voice. You are talking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation, and she is not like you, Brian. She did not inherit her fortune or take it from someone else. She rebuilt her life from the wreckage you created. Just then, a very impatient Chloe clicked her way over to their table in her towering high heels. She glanced at the three of them, feeling the tension, but not being smart enough to understand what was happening. Honey, what is taking so much time? Chloe complained, clinging to Brian's arm. She gave Emma a scornful look. Oh, it is you. Wow, you have really let yourself go. I guess the single life is not treating you well. A heavy silence filled the air. Emma did not react with anger. Instead, she offered a slow smile full of pity. You must be Chloe. Brian has always been drawn to shiny things with no real substance. Chloe was speechless. Excuse me? You can keep him, Emma declared, directing her attention back to the menu. I am done with him, but I will give you some friendly advice. You should review the prenuptial agreement. Brian is very careful with his money. Adrian let out a dark laugh. Marcus, please remove them. They are spoiling my dinner. The security guard moved toward them. His large frame was intimidating. This is not finished, Emma, Brian growled as the guards guided him away. You cannot keep my child away from me. I will ruin you in court. Adrian Vance rose to his feet. He seemed to loom over Brian. He leaned in close, his voice a quiet threat near Brian's ear. If you dare to sue her, if you attempt to bother her, or if you so much as glance her way again, I will do more than just sue you, Brian. I will purchase your company, sell it off piece by piece, and you will have nothing left except for that inexpensive suit you are wearing. Do not challenge me. Brian backed away. He had no other option. He returned to his table, with Chloe complaining in his ear about their rudeness. But Brian was not listening. He took his seat, gazing at the empty chair where his future was supposed to be sitting. He watched Emma sharing a laugh with a billionaire, pregnant with a child, who could be the heir to 2 fortunes. And in that moment, for the very first time, Brian Thorne felt insignificant. But the evening was not nearly done. As Brian motioned for the bill, eager to get away, he noticed a man in a gray suit nearing Adrian's table. He was a court official. Brian froze. Was someone suing Adrian? No. The man continued past Adrian and came directly to Brian's table. Brian Thorne? The man inquired. Yes. You have been served, the man stated, placing a thick envelope on the table beside a wine stain. Brian quickly opened it, his hands trembling. This was not a legal notice from Adrian. It was from Emma. Plaintiff, Emma Vance Cross. The subject was the theft of intellectual property related to the Thorne algorithmic model. A chill went down Brian's spine. The algorithm, the programming that had earned him his first $1 billion, the programming he took credit for, the programming Emma had actually created for him in their college apartment 10 years earlier. This was not just about getting even. She wanted to take it all. The morning light streamed through the glass walls of Brian Thorne's office, but it offered no comfort. The room was cold, with a sterile feeling that matched the tense atmosphere among the 3 men at the mahogany table. Brian sat with his face in his hands. Across from him sat Marcus Sterling, his top lawyer, a man who typically charged $500 an hour to look uninterested, but today he looked truly frightened. "Please tell me this is some kind of sick joke, Sterling," Brian said under his breath, pushing the legal papers across the table. She was an English major. She just checked my emails for spelling. She did not create that code. Sterling took off his glasses, and a drop of sweat ran down his forehead. "Brian, our digital forensics team has examined the source code for the Thorn algorithmic model, which is the core of your company. They discovered something hidden deep inside the core programming, some hidden data." "So what?" Brian demanded. Sterling pressed a button on his computer, showing an image on the wall. It was a long line of code, but tucked inside were personal notes from the programmer to Brian. "So you can finally get some sleep tonight, love, E." Brian just stared at the projected image. The memory struck him with the force of a punch. It happened 7 years ago. He was about to fail his final exams because his program kept failing. He had fallen asleep, completely exhausted, on their small sofa. When he awoke, the program was working perfectly. Emma was there with a fresh cup of coffee and a weary smile. She mentioned she had tinkered with it a little. He thought she had simply corrected a small error. He never imagined she had rebuilt the entire system from the ground up. "It is even worse than that," Sterling said, his voice low. "The legal papers state that she registered the copyright for this exact system using the name Ghostwriter 3 days before your company launched. She is the legal owner of the intellectual property, Brian, and she is requesting an emergency court order to shut down your servers until an agreement is made." "Shut us down?" Brian jumped up, sending his chair flying. "If our servers are offline for 1 hour, our stock will fall by 10%. If they are offline for good, Thorntech will be out of business in a week." "Then you have to make a deal," Sterling stated with a serious expression. "Offer her anything she desires: money, company shares, a public apology. Because if this ends up in court, she has all the digital evidence and Adrian Vance's entire legal department supporting her. They will completely destroy us." Brian went to the window and gazed out at the city he believed was his. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Chloe. It read, "Honey, my credit card was just rejected at Gucci. You need to handle this now. Everyone is looking at me." Brian hurled his phone at the wall, and it broke into pieces. He could not afford to lose his company. He was Brian Thorne. He was a brilliant innovator. He was not a fake who succeeded because of his wife's work. "Where is she now?" Brian asked, facing Sterling again. "She is the host of the Silver Gala at the Metropolitan Museum this evening," Sterling answered. "It is an event to raise money for single mothers. The tickets cost $20,000 a person." "Get me a ticket," Brian commanded. "Brian, if you go near her, it would be a violation of the restraining order." I said, "Get me a ticket," Brian yelled. "I am not going to bother her. I'm going to make her remember that she once loved me. Emma is a kind person. She is driven by her feelings. If I can get her by herself, away from Vance, I can calm her down. I can convince her to stop this." Sterling seemed unconvinced, but he took out his phone. "I will see what I can do. But Brian, she does not seem so soft anymore." The Metropolitan Museum had been turned into a dazzling spectacle of silver and white. The most powerful people in the city, including politicians, wealthy heirs, and tech billionaires, moved through the grand halls with glasses of champagne. Brian came by himself. He had not invited Chloe. He wanted to appear somber and regretful. He had on his most formal suit, yet he felt like he did not belong there. Every quiet conversation he passed seemed to be about him. "Did you see that Thorntech's stock price is dropping today? I heard Vance Global is buying up a huge part of a new competitor." Brian worked his way through the guests, searching for a dress of emerald green, but he saw no green that night. He saw silver instead. Emma stood on a raised stage near the Temple of Dendur, addressing the audience with a microphone. She was wearing a silver maternity dress that glowed like liquid moonlight. She looked majestic and out of reach, like a queen speaking to her people. And for that reason, the Vance Foundation is committing $50 million to provide legal assistance for women who have been unfairly left with nothing in their divorce cases, Emma announced, her voice confident and firm. The guests broke into loud applause. Brian felt a wave of sickness in his stomach. That fund was a clear attack against him. When Emma came down from the stage, she was quickly surrounded by well-wishers, and Brian saw his chance and went for it. He navigated his way through the gathering, paying no attention to the disapproving looks from people he had ignored before. "Emma," he shouted, right as she was being led away by her security team. She paused. The people around them moved aside, sensing the unfolding drama. This was the confrontation everyone had been whispering about. Emma turned around slowly. For a change, Adrian was not with her. He was on the other side of the room, talking to a senator. This was Brian's opportunity. "Brian," she said, her face gave nothing away. "You purchased a ticket. How thoughtful of you. I will consider that $20,000 a down payment on the alimony you still owe me." The mention of alimony caused a few people to laugh quietly. Brian moved in closer, speaking quietly in a desperate tone. "Emma, please, we have to talk in private. Anything I have to say to you can be said in court," she responded without emotion. "It is about the company," Brian begged. "You're going to ruin it. Do you realize how many people are going to be out of a job? I understand that you are upset with me, but please do not punish my employees for it. That is not the person you are. You are a good person. You are the kind of person who rescues stray cats." Emma's eyes lit up with anger. The woman who rescued stray cats disappeared the night she had to sleep in her car because her husband had cut off all her credit cards. A gasp went through the crowd. The color drained from Brian's face. He had prayed that secret would stay buried forever. "I did not know you had nowhere to live," he stammered. "I just assumed you went to your parents' house." "My parents are gone, Brian. You were aware of that. You just did not care." She moved a step closer, her voice sinking to a deadly whisper. "And this company is not your company. It was built using my code. It was built on my sleepless nights and my brilliance. You are only the public face, Brian, and I'm about to tear that mask away." "Emma, stop," Brian pleaded, reaching out for her hand. "What about our child? If you ruin me, you ruin his entire future. That baby is mine, is he not? You know in your heart that he needs his father." Emma glanced down at his hand on her arm, then looked back into his eyes. She did not flinch or pull away. A smile touched her lips, but it was a cold smile that held no warmth. "You want to talk about the baby, Brian?" "Yes," he whispered, believing he had found a way to reach her. "I have a right to know the truth." "All right," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the onlookers nearby. "The evening you threw me out, I was holding a small gift box. Do you recall that?" Brian's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. Yes, she had been clutching a little white box. He had swatted it from her hand, desperate to get her out of the apartment before Chloe arrived. "I remember," he admitted in a low voice. "Inside that box was a positive pregnancy test," Emma said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury, "and next to it was a tiny pair of baby booties. I was trying to say, Brian, we are starting a family, and you just stared at me and said, 'Take your garbage and get out of my house.'" Brian felt as if every drop of blood had left his body. The entire room seemed to tilt. "So do not stand here now and act like you care about being a father," Emma hissed. "You threw your own child away before he was even born, but now he has a father, a real man who held me when I cried, who attended every single ultrasound, who built the nursery with his own 2 hands. It is not the same thing, Brian protested, his voice weak. Biology is what matters. Biology makes you a sperm donor, Brian. Love is what makes you a father. Just then, a heavy hand clamped down on Brian's shoulder. It was Adrian Vance. He had crossed the entire ballroom in mere seconds. "Is there an issue here?" Adrian asked. His tone was quiet, but it had a terrifying depth. "We are just having a conversation," Brian said, attempting to shrug the hand off his shoulder. He could not. Adrian's grip was like solid steel. "It appeared to me that you were distressing my wife," Adrian stated. "She is not your wife yet," Brian spat, his jealousy surging. Adrian just smiled. He reached inside his jacket and took out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it into Brian's breast pocket. "You should read this when you are outside. It is a copy of the final adoption papers. I legally adopted the child in utero 2 weeks ago. I had Emma's complete consent and the full approval of the court, citing proven abandonment by the biological father." Brian just stared at him, his mouth hanging open. "You cannot do that." "I am Adrian Vance," he said, as if that explained everything. "I can do anything I want. Now, leave my sight before I have security throw you down the main staircase." Utterly humiliated, completely defeated, and feeling the stares of New York's elite burning into his back, Brian turned and ran. He stumbled outside into the cool evening air of Central Park. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper Adrian had given him. It was not just adoption paperwork. There was a DNA test result attached to the back. Subject: Brian Thorne. Result: 0% probability of paternity. Brian stood frozen. He read it a second time. 0%. He frantically looked over the document. That is when he saw the doctor's note at the very bottom. The subject has a congenital condition that renders him sterile. This condition has likely been present since adolescence. Brian let the paper slip from his fingers and drift to the sidewalk. He was not the father. He had never been the father. He could never be a father. But if he was sterile and Emma was pregnant, then who was the father? And then the truth hit him like a physical blow. The timeline. The business trip Emma had taken by herself a year ago to the West Coast, where Vance Global's headquarters was located. She had not met Adrian 6 months ago. She had known him before their divorce. The rain in New York City never washes things clean. It only makes the filth on the streets slicker. Brian stood on the sidewalk just outside a specialized fertility clinic on the Upper East Side. The heavy oak door shut behind him with a final thud that seemed to echo in his very bones. He had stormed in there, demanding answers, threatening lawsuits against the clinic for malpractice, and screaming that the DNA test from Adrian was a fake. The doctor, an older man with absolutely no patience for billionaires having temper tantrums, had simply retrieved Brian's file from 20 years ago. It was a chart from when Brian was hospitalized as a teenager for a severe complication related to multiple sclerosis. "I informed your parents at that time, Mr. Thorne," the doctor had said as he adjusted his glasses. "The damage was irreversible. You have never been capable of fathering children. We simply assumed that you knew." Brian walked aimlessly in the rain, his expensive Italian shoes splashing through deep puddles. He had not known, or perhaps, deep down, he had chosen to ignore all the signs. For 5 long years, he had put all the blame on Emma. Every single month, when she got her period, he would sigh, look at her with open disappointment, and make a cruel remark about her biological clock ticking away. He had made her feel like she was the one who was broken. He had sent her to countless specialists, made her take hormones that made her feel sick, and publicly shamed her when nothing worked. And all that time, he was the broken one. He flagged down a taxi, his hands trembling. He had to get home. He had to explain everything to Chloe. Chloe! The thought struck him. Chloe was with him only because he had promised her everything. He had promised her a business dynasty. If she discovered he was infertile and that his company was about to implode, she would vanish before the morning headlines even came out. He walked into his penthouse, completely soaked. The entire apartment was a disaster. Shopping bags from Chanel, Hermes, and Prada were scattered everywhere. Chloe was on the sofa, surrounded by open boxes, shouting into her phone. I do not care that the card was declined. Run it a second time. Do you have any idea who my boyfriend is? She looked up as Brian entered, dripping water all over the marble floor. Finally, Brian, you need to fix my black card. It is making me look bad. Brian stared at her. He truly looked at her. She was beautiful, of course, but it was an empty, artificial kind of beauty. There was no warmth in her eyes at all, only greed. Chloe, he said, start packing your things. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh. Excuse me, are we flying to Paris? No, Brian said, as he walked over and kicked a Chanel box clear across the room. You are leaving. Get out of here. Chloe shot to her feet, her face contorting into an ugly sneer. You cannot be serious. Do you really think you can throw me out the same way you did your ex-wife? My ex-wife, Brian said, the words feeling like they were being torn from his throat, was worth 10 of you. She is the one who built me. All you do is drain me dry. Get out, Chloe. I am finished paying for your company. Fine, she screamed, grabbing a fistful of jewelry from a nearby table. You are boring anyway, and just so you know, Brian, everyone makes fun of you. You think you are some kind of king, but you are nothing more than a walking ATM. And I heard all about the lawsuit. You're going to be broke, Brian, and being poor is not a good look for you. She stormed out of the penthouse, slamming the door so forcefully that the walls actually shook. Brian was completely alone. He poured a drink and stared out at the glittering city lights. He had ruined his marriage for a woman who never loved him. He had lost the one person in the world who had ever truly had faith in him. But then, his sadness began to transform into something far darker. A cold, vicious anger started to swell inside him. Emma knew. She must have known all along. If she was pregnant now, and the baby was not his, and he was sterile, it could only mean one thing. She had cheated on him. The timeline kept bothering him. They had been divorced for 6 months, but she was 7 months pregnant. She had slept with another man while they were still married. Brian laughed. A strange, manic sound. Saint Emma, the woman who acted so perfect and pure. She was an adulteress. He grabbed his phone. He dialed a number he had not called in years, a slimy tabloid reporter named Barry, who owed him a big favor. Barry, Brian said, his voice slick and dangerous. I have a major scoop for you. I have the real story behind the Adrian Vance and Emma Cross romance. It is about how the billionaire stole another man's wife and how Saint Emma was carrying another man's child while she was still sleeping in her husband's bed. That is pure dynamite, Brian, Barry said, his voice full of glee. But do you have proof of the timeline? The baby is all the proof we need, Brian lied. Run the story. Ruin her reputation completely. If she wants to sue me for my company, I will make sure she is too humiliated to even show her face in a courtroom. Brian ended the call. He felt a sick sense of triumph. If he was going to be ruined, he would drag everyone else down with him. The headline the following morning was absolutely brutal. Billionaire's baby scandal. Did Adrian Vance steal his pregnant mistress from a heartbroken husband? The article positioned Brian as the sympathetic victim, a dedicated, hard-working husband who was blindsided by a cheating wife who had then seduced a richer man to climb the social ladder. It strongly implied that the baby was the result of a secret affair that happened inside Brian's own home. Brian sat in his office and watched the firestorm erupt on social media. Public opinion was starting to turn. People began calling Emma a gold digger. They started to question the integrity of Adrian Vance. "This is going to force them to settle," Brian said to Marcus Sterling, whose face was pale with worry. "They will have to drop the lawsuit just to make all this bad press disappear." "Brian," Sterling said, staring down at his tablet, "you need to look at this. Vance Global just announced a press conference. They are streaming it live right now." Brian swiveled his chair to face the enormous screen on his office wall. Adrian Vance was standing at a podium. He did not look nervous. He did not look angry. He looked like an executioner. Standing right beside him was Emma. She was not trying to hide. She looked directly into the camera, and her expression was absolutely fierce. "This morning," Adrian began, his powerful voice filling the room through the speakers, "a desperate man attempted to use the media to bully a pregnant woman. Brian Thorne has to model. Accused my fiancée of being unfaithful. He has told everyone that I wrecked a happy home." Adrienne stopped and stared directly into the camera. "We expected this kind of behavior, because liars always believe that everyone else lies too." Adrienne moved aside, and Emma approached the microphone. "I never cheated on Brian Thorne," she stated clearly. "For 7 years, I was a faithful wife. I was his rock when we had nothing. I am the one who wrote the code that made him a billionaire, often while he slept." She raised a document for the camera to see. "This is a medical report. It is from the Mayo Clinic and is dated 8 months ago, which was 1 month before Brian divorced me. It proves that I went through a single round of IVF treatment using a donor." Brian froze in place. "IVF? I did this?" Emma's voice trembled just a little as she continued. "I did it because my husband desperately wanted an heir, but he refused to see a doctor about his own issues. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to give him the family he always said he wanted. I used my own savings to pay for it. I went through all the injections by myself." A deep silence filled the room on the screen, and the same silence fell over Brian's office. "I learned that the procedure was a success on the very same day that Brian served me with divorce papers," Emma said, as a single tear finally rolled down her cheek. "I tried to explain it to him. He refused to listen. He threw me out of our home. I was pregnant, homeless, and utterly alone. That was the moment Adrian Vance found me. He did not steal me from you, Brian. You threw me away. He simply picked up the treasure that you were too blind to recognize." Adrian returned to the microphone. "Regarding the business, Mr. Thorne appears to have forgotten a critical detail about the ghostwriter software that he stole." Brian felt his stomach plummet. "Emma did not just write the original code," Adrian explained with a grim smile. "She also protected it. There is a fail-safe program embedded deep within the system. It is a kill switch. It was designed to activate if the unauthorized user, Brian, attempted to alter the core files. According to our logs, his technology team did exactly that this morning, trying to erase the evidence of his theft." Adrienne glanced at his watch. "The kill switch activates in 3, 2, 1. Back in Brian's office, the overhead lights flickered. Then, the steady hum of the servers throughout the building went silent. Brian's computer monitor turned black. "Sir!" his assistant screamed as she burst into the room. "The platform is gone. The application is gone. Everything has gone offline. The code, it has vanished. It is deleting itself from the servers." Brian slammed his fists on his keyboard in a panic. It was useless. There was only a black screen with a small green text blinking in the corner. "Error, user unauthorized." Goodbye, Brian. On the television screen, Adrian Vance leaned toward the microphone. Thorntech is, for all intents and purposes, a hollowed-out company with zero assets. Its stock is currently in a complete nosedive. I have also reached out to the SEC to provide them with evidence of Brian Thorne's embezzlement of company money, which he used to finance his mistress's lavish lifestyle. Adrianen's gaze was as cold as steel. Checkmate, Brian. The broadcast ended. Brian just sat in the dead silence of his office. Then his phone started ringing. It was the board of directors, followed by the SEC, followed by his bank. He ignored the calls. He walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window and gazed down at the streets of Manhattan. He had always wanted to be a king. He had always wanted people to fear him. He had finally gotten his wish. He was now feared, but only as a cautionary tale. He watched a black SUV pull up to the street far below. He saw a small figure, wearing a green coat, get into the vehicle, with a tall man helping her. Even from that high up, he could see the tenderness in the man's gesture. Emma. She had won. She had done more than just defeat him. She had completely erased him. Brian collapsed to the floor. The silence of his empty office felt like a crushing weight pressing down on him. He reached into his pocket and took out an old, crumpled photograph he had carried in his wallet for years. It was a picture of him and Emma in their college dorm, sitting on the floor eating pizza and laughing. They had been broke, but he had looked genuinely happy. He understood now, with the full weight of his utter ruin crashing down on him, that moment was the wealthiest he had ever been, and he had thrown it all away for a diamond chandelier that was not even real. In the business world, 3 years is an eternity. In 3 years, new companies are born, empires crumble, and names that once lit up the headlines are forgotten and swept away. But for Brian Thorne, those 3 years felt like 300 years. His downfall was not quick. It was not the clean, swift end he had almost wished for when his office screens went dark. Instead, it was a slow, painful dismantling of his life. The SEC investigation lasted for 18 months, a public humiliation that stripped away every last piece of dignity he had. The penthouse was the first thing to go, followed by the cars and then the art. He clearly remembered the day the federal agents came to seize his watch collection. He just stood there as a man in a cheap jacket handled his Patek Philippe, the one he had bought after making his first $10 million, and dropped it into an evidence bag like a piece of plastic junk. That was the day Chloe left him. She did not even bother to pack. She just ordered an Uber, gave him a look completely empty of affection, and said, "You are bad for my brand, Brian." Now, 3 years later, Brian was shivering on a sidewalk on East Wacker Drive in Chicago. The wind coming off the lake was a brutal attack, a sharp, wet cold that cut right through the thin material of his polyester uniform. He was no longer Brian Thorne, the tech visionary. He was just Jules, the lowest-ranking valet at the Grand Plaza Hotel. "Hey, Jules, snap out of it." The voice belonged to Manny, the 20-year-old captain of the valets, who spent his shifts vaping and scrolling through TikTok. Manny had no idea who Brian used to be. To Manny, Brian was just the quiet, graying man who was not fast enough on the sprints to the garage and whose hands shook too much when he handled the keys. "I am awake," Brian mumbled, stamping his feet to try and bring some feeling back into them. His cheap shoes were leaking. The icy slush from the street had soaked his socks hours before. "It is a big night tonight," Manny said, exhaling a cloud of strawberry-flavored vapor into Brian's face. "The future of tech Gala. We have got very important people showing up all night. Do not scratch anything, old man. These cars are worth more than you will ever be." Brian winced. The future of tech Gala. 5 years ago, he had been the main speaker at this exact event. He remembered the sound of the applause. He remembered the feeling of the hot, blinding spotlight as he lectured everyone about vision and innovation. He remembered Emma in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap, looking up at him with a pride he now knew he had never earned. She had worn a simple blue dress that evening because he had told her the designer gown she'd had her eye on was too attention-grabbing. Tonight, he was not the keynote speaker. He was just part of the staff. The large hotel doors swung open, spilling warm, golden light and the sound of a jazz band onto the snowy sidewalk. The smell of expensive perfume and roasting prime rib drifted out, a painful reminder of the hunger pains in Brian's stomach. He had skipped lunch just to save $5 for his electric bill. The guests started to exit the hotel. Brian saw faces he knew. Marcus Sterling, his former lawyer, was there, laughing with a new, wealthy client. Sterling looked straight past Brian while handing him the claim ticket for a Mercedes. Brian accepted the ticket with his head down, the bill of his cap hiding his face. He brought the car around, took a $2 tip without saying a word, and watched as Sterling sped off. It was a unique form of torture, being completely invisible in a world where he had once been treated like a god. "Pay attention," Manny hissed, adjusting his jacket. "We have a big shot arriving. Private car, blacked out Escalade. That is the Vance security team." Vance, the name struck Brian like an electric shock. The air caught in his throat. He felt an urge to run. He wanted to fake an illness, hide in the employee break room, or just melt into the pavement. Anything to avoid being here right now. But he was stuck. His feet felt cemented to the ground, held in place by a mix of pure fear and a dark, self-destructive curiosity. The huge black vehicle pulled up to the curb with two security cars right behind it. It did not just look like a car, it looked like a rolling fortress. The engine produced a low, powerful rumble that made Brian's teeth chatter. "Jules, get the door," Manny ordered. Distracted by his attempts to flirt with a socialite wearing a fur coat, Brian moved forward. His hands were shaking so much that he had to quickly clasp them behind his back to try and control them. He walked toward the rear passenger door. He could see his own reflection in the dark-tinted window, a thin, hollow-faced man with gray stubble and haunted-looking eyes. At 35, he looked 20 years older. He reached out and pulled the heavy door handle. The door opened smoothly, releasing a wave of warm air. It smelled of rich leather, cedar, and jasmine. The first thing he noticed was a shoe. A perfectly polished, handmade Italian Oxford. Adrian Vance emerged from the car. The years had been very good to Adrian. If anything, time had only enhanced his commanding presence. He looked broader, and his salt and pepper hair was cut in a precise military style. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. He paid no attention to the valet. He turned back toward the car and offered his hand. "Be careful, my love. It is slippery out here." A hand reached out to take his. It was a hand Brian knew better than his own. He knew the shape of those fingers and the delicate curve of that wrist. He remembered how that hand felt when it used to soothe his forehead when he was sick. He remembered how it felt scrubbing dishes in their first cramped apartment. Emma stepped out of the car. Brian felt all the air rush out of his body. She was breathtaking. The timid, quiet woman was gone. The woman who stood before him was a queen. She was wearing a floor-length gown made of deep red velvet that perfectly fit her form, covered by a white coat that looked like freshly fallen snow. Her hair was styled in soft, elegant waves, and a diamond necklace glittered at her neck. They were not the large, flashy jewels that Chloe had always insisted on, but tasteful, classic stones. Yet it was not just the clothes. It was her face. The worry lines that had marked her face during their marriage had vanished, replaced by a deep sense of peace that radiated from her. Gave her a certain radiance. She looked peaceful. She looked cherished. "Wait for me?" A tiny voice called out from inside the car. Brian's blood ran cold. A little boy, no older than 3, clambered to the edge of the seat. He was wrapped up warm in a tiny navy peacoat and a red scarf. His hair was dark and curly, and his curious, bright eyes took in everything around him with amazement. Adrienne let out a deep, joyful laugh, a sound Brian had never heard aimed his way. "We would never forget you, Leo. Come on, buddy." Adrienne lifted the boy easily and settled him on his hip. The little boy giggled and wrapped his tiny arms around Adrian's neck. "Daddy, did you see the robot?" the boy asked, his voice full of excitement. "The one that had lasers?" "I sure did," Adrian answered, kissing the top of his son's head. "But I have a feeling you were a bigger fan of the dessert table." "I love cookies," Leo announced, with great seriousness. Emma chuckled, gently wiping a snowflake from the boy's nose. "You are 100% your father's son, a love for sweets and a fascination with lasers. Your father's son." Those words ricocheted inside Brian's mind, rattling around in the hollow space where his soul used to be. His father's son. Leo was not Brian's child. He could never have been. The DNA results had been the final, crushing blow to his pride. The test proved he was sterile. He was a biological dead end. All that talk about his legacy, about building a dynasty, about the Thorne family name, it was all just a pathetic lie. The true legacy was standing right there before his eyes. A joyful, healthy little boy being raised by a man who earned respect without ever having to demand it. Brian just stood there, by the car door, completely frozen. He knew he was supposed to shut the door. He should have just stepped away and disappeared into the background. But he found it impossible to tear his eyes away from the child. The boy had Emma's nose. He had her smile too. Then, all of a sudden, the little boy's gaze shifted to him. Leo's eyes met Brian's. The child saw no failure. He saw no washed-up fraud. He only saw a man wearing a funny hat who was standing out in the snow. "Hi," Leo said, giving a little wave with his mittened hand. The simple sound of the boy's voice broke what was left of Brian's self-control. Hot tears welled up in his eyes instantly. He tried to form a word, to say hello back, but his throat felt tight and closed. Emma turned her head. She looked where her son was looking. Her gaze fell upon the valet. For just a second, the world stood still. Snowflakes drifted down silently. The sounds of the city seemed to disappear. Then, the realization slowly crept into her expression. It was not a dramatic moment. She did not gasp. She did not clutch her pearls in shock. Her eyes just widened ever so slightly. She saw the cheap uniform, the soaked shoes, the graying hair, and the name tag that said Jules. Brian prepared himself. He was waiting for the sneer. He was waiting for her to laugh. He thought she would tap Adrienne on the shoulder and say, "Look at that, honey. Look what we found." A part of him almost wished she would. He had earned her anger. Anger would at least mean he still had some importance to her, even if it was negative. But Emma showed no anger. Instead, her face softened. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. She gazed at him with a deep and overwhelming sadness. It was the same look you would give a stray animal that has been hurt too often to trust anyone. It was simple pity, pure detached pity. She never said his name. She gave no sign of their shared history. She did not ask how he was doing. She just turned her attention back to her husband and her son. "It is getting cold, Adrienne," she said in a quiet voice. "We should get Leo inside the jet." He is starting to shiver. Of course, Adrian agreed. Then he turned toward Brian. Adrian had no idea who he was. For Adrian Vance, Brian Thorne was just a minor detail, a forgotten bad guy from the early days of his relationship with Emma. He was so unimportant that his face did not even seem familiar. Excellent service, Adrian said. His tone was businesslike but still polite. He reached inside his coat pocket and took out some cash. He pushed the bill into Brian's hand. Try to stay warm, Adrian added. Brian glanced down at his hand. It was a brand new, crisp, $100 bill. The face of Benjamin Franklin seemed to stare back, making fun of him. Thank you, sir, Brian managed to whisper. His voice was so hoarse and broken that he barely recognized it himself. Adrian gave a nod and turned to lead his family to the hotel's private entrance, where a car was waiting to drive them to the airfield. Bye-bye, Leo chirped from over Adrian's shoulder, waving his little mitten once more. Brian lifted a trembling hand and gave a tiny, feeble wave in return. Goodbye, he mouthed silently. He stood and watched as they walked away. He watched Adrienne lean over to whisper something in Emma's ear, and he saw Emma rest her head on Adrian's shoulder. They moved together like a single unit, a strong, impenetrable circle of warmth and affection. They were a complete family, and Brian was simply the person who held the door for them. When the heavy glass doors of the hotel shut behind them, blocking his view, the quiet of the street came rushing back. The wind was howling, gusting hard around the corner of the building. Brian stared at the $100 bill he was holding. In his former life, he might have used a bill like this to light one of his cigars. He would have left a tip this large for a waitress who only brought him a glass of water. He would have scoffed at how meaningless the amount was. But now, this single piece of paper represented the difference between having a meal and going hungry. It meant the difference between staying warm and freezing. He clenched the bill in his fist so tightly his knuckles went white. A sob started to build deep in his chest, a sharp, painful feeling he could no longer hold back. He leaned his back against the cold stone wall of the hotel, sliding down until he was huddled on the damp sidewalk. He had dedicated his whole life to building a fortress of wealth to keep everyone at a distance, believing that was what made a man strong. He had always treated people like they were assets, liabilities, or products to be traded. He had thrown away the one woman who had ever loved him unconditionally. He did it all because he wanted a life that looked better in the pages of a magazine. He had desperately wanted to be a king, and now he finally understood the truth. Kings are nothing more than men wearing costumes. The real strength was never in the crown itself. It was in having a hand to hold when the cold snow began to fall. Emma had found someone's hand to hold. Brian only had his own two hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Hey, Jules," Manny yelled from his booth, totally unaware of the broken man on the pavement. "Quit counting your tips. There is a Corolla pulling in. Let us go." Brian used the coarse sleeve of his jacket to wipe his face. He drew in a long, shaky breath. The frigid air stung his lungs, bringing him back to reality. "I am coming," he managed to croak out. He pushed himself to his feet. He straightened out his cheap, oversized jacket. He tucked the $100 bill, a handout from his ex-wife's new husband, into his pocket right next to his bus pass. He walked over to the beat-up Corolla that was pulling up to the curb. He pulled the door open, forced a smile onto his lips, and slightly bowed his head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," Brian whispered softly. "How may I assist you?" And that, my friends, was the cold, silent downfall of Brian Thorne. There was no big explosion, no dramatic fight in a jail cell, just the slow, chilling realization that he had designed his own miserable fate. He dedicated his life to pursuing things of value, but he never learned what had true worth. He tossed aside a real diamond because he was chasing something that just glittered, and by the time he understood his error, that diamond was already set in another man's crown. It is a truly harsh lesson in karma. Sometimes the real punishment is not about what happens to you, but about all the things that will never happen for you. Brian lost out on the family, the love, and the legacy. All he got was the tip. Now, I really want to hear what you think in the comments below. That look Emma gave him, that look of pity, do you believe that was more painful than if she had just screamed at him? Is being completely indifferent the best form of revenge? And if you were in Emma's shoes, would you have said anything at all to him? Or do you think she did the right thing by simply walking away? Let us start a good discussion down in the comments. If this story sent a shiver down your spine, please go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show these stories to a wider audience. Make sure you subscribe and turn on your notifications so you will not miss any of the drama. Thank you for watching, and always remember, be very careful who you step on during your climb to the top, because you just might have to face them on your way back down. Remember this: the people who truly love you do not ask you to shrink yourself so they can feel bigger. They help you grow, even when it means you might outshine them. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Was Emma's silent pity more devastating than any words could ever be? I really want to hear your thoughts. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that reminds you of your worth. Thank you for being here. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and lasting value to our audience.